Well, thank you, Joe. I mean, I am a financial journalist, so expert is always a little bit of a strange term. I think I'm just very good at talking loudly and at length about stuff. But water is something I developed a passion for way back in the year that I'm going to try and forget, when I was at college still. In fact, I found my college dissertation on water in the Middle East over the weekend, bizarrely. Who knows why I found it, but I did. Wasn't looking for it. But look, the way we come at this, for those of you who don't know Breakingviews, we are the financial commentary arm of Reuters. So if you've seen what we do, you're probably thinking, don't they cover banks? Don't they cover mergers? Don't they cover all things to do with Wall Street and the city? Well, yes, we do. But the reason why we got involved in this event, and why I particularly am looking at sustainability in general and water in particular, is because a few years ago, I made a pitch to my bosses saying, look, there's a lot of money going into this space, the space of sustainability, ESG, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of it's going into, or not going into the right areas, or it's going into the right areas, or it's going to be used well or poorly or indifferently. In other words, it is a perfect thing for us as financial journalists and commentators to be looking at. And lo and behold, here we are 4 or 5 years later with many trillions more assets under management allegedly being committed to environmental, social and governance issues. I think allegedly is an apt term for that. I think we can debate that all day long, not today though. And water for me is, as I said, I covered this at college, and I came back into it a few years ago when I realized there was a way to play finance, economics and water development into often, I hope, pretty good articles for our audience. And actually, given that many of them are investment bankers and investors, even 5 or 6 years ago when we started doing this, some of our water pieces actually got some of the best hits on a monthly basis of the various daily pieces that we put out. Now, before I give my quick introduction to how I think, or how we think the water crisis is developing, I just want to bring up a quick poll that we've got for you. We're going to do it now and at the end as well to see whether we have changed your minds on anything. Not that anything we're going to say is particularly, well, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 things might be controversial, but I think the ideas we've come up with in the poll are, well, I think that if you've had any interest in this space at all, you'll recognize them. But what will be interesting to see is whether our 3 panelists will make you think that one thing is more important than you thought it might have been at the start. So Joe's going to put that poll up in a second. There you go. So by all means, have a look through that and choose what you think is the chief contributor to undermining global water security. And of course, avoiding a global water crisis is the topic of today. Now, let me start off by being a typical journalist and being, the doom and gloom monger. We're already in a crisis. Global water crisis has been with us for a long time. We can look back at just over the past 3 or 4 years, you can look back at various cities that have faced awful problems with water, whether that's Cape Town, whether that's Chennai. You can look at various around the world as well. I've focused a lot on the American West, largely because I'm based in New York. But also I've looked at what's happening in the UK. We've looked, my colleagues in Asia have looked at what's happening with the headwaters coming out of the Himalayas. It is a big problem. Now, why is that? Well, you can look at various things to try and explain it. It's development. So companies and people using water unsustainably, whatever we want to say that means. So overdrawing groundwater and water basins in general. You can look at California and Colorado for this. You can look at Cape Town. You can look all over the place where the development of water resources has been done using often outmoded techniques or even outmoded data, or in fact, in the case of the Colorado River, data that was already wrong, and they knew it when they first came up with how to share it back in 1922. So there's how we develop water resources. The population is rising. I'm sure you've all seen these figures. Just to reiterate, the global population will be going up by about 25% over the next 30 years to 9.7 billion, according to the United Nations. We've got pollution all over the place. It's in some respects better than it was 40, 50 years ago, certainly here in the States, where there's still lots of problems. A case even made it to the Supreme Court of the United States a couple of months ago. And I'm sure if you just look over to what happened in Russia recently, there was a massive fuel spill in the Arctic Circle. Governance, let's not forget governance. We'll be talking a lot about governance today, I think, an issue that is often overlooked, but is very often one of the chief reasons behind water problems in many areas that I've looked at, from Cape Town to Chennai to the Colorado. It could be water rights, it could be which part of the government controls what part of the water, and whether it's supply, demand, or the resources themselves. And we haven't even got to the thing that I'm sure many of you are thinking must be the biggest and the worst thing, which is climate change. In fact, I believe that has just won the poll at 29%. And climate change, well, what's climate change doing? It is making everything worse. So it's making areas either far more arid, kind of refuse to use the word drought these days. It implies there's nothing we can do about it. It's making areas flood more, and often the same area can be both arid and then very quickly after it flood as well. We have got also, sorry, I've just lost my space, which happens all the time when I'm using two screens. Let me just go back, there we go. Yeah, so, and we've got, I'm gonna stop there because I have in fact wonderfully lost my place. So I'm gonna just move on and say, look, these are all the bad things. The good things are that we've got corporations in general, despite one of the questions we've got up there, some corporations are doing a really good job, and we'll have one or two other panelists talking about that. I'm gonna give you two examples. AB InBev is talking about how it's helping its farmers and other suppliers, especially its farmers, to develop water resources better. Often farmers need 3 or 4 years to implement this, but don't have the financing. So AB InBev and others are talking about how to do it. Procter & Gamble is talking about a 50 litre a day home. And just by way of comparison, 50 litres is, I think in Cape Town 2 years ago, homeowners were not allowed to have even that much, I think. So to go for that kind of target is pretty good. And there are other issues we're going to come through as well, whether it's technology and the use of AI. And that's where I think our panelists are going to come in. They will present some of the issues we've got, but also talk about how we're going to try and get around some of these issues. So let me just let you know who we've got. We've got Betsy Otto. She's going to kick off. She is the director of the World Water Resources, the World Resources Institute's water program. We have Ambika Jindal, who I did warn her I was going to say this. She is a pseudo-reformed investment banker who currently runs the Dutch government's Valuing Water initiative, and Giulio Boccaletti, who is global head of strategy at the Nature Conservancy, and has been focusing on water for longer than probably either he or I would like to remember. But he has some great examples he's going to come up with later. So, Betsy, I'm going to hand it over to you. I know you guys have done a lot of work on water over the years. The one thing I saw recently that we talked about at length, in fact, we had a webinar with some of your guys on this a few months ago, was the Achieving Abundance report, which looked at both the financing of and the supply-demand gap of water around the world. But look, I'll hand over to you, Betsy, to kick off and give us your view of the problems of water and how we can go about solving water security.
Thanks very much, Anthony, and great to be with everybody. And thanks also to the Conduit team, Joe Spiro and others for putting this together and giving us a chance to talk about the world's water crisis. Let me give a little bit more context maybe to what Anthony was just talked about. And just a moment, maybe some of you may not know, WRI, World Resources Institute, or a global research organization with about 1,000 experts that work globally in 60 countries. We have offices in Africa, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Mexico, the US, Europe, and so on. We work at the nexus of the environment, economic opportunity, and human well-being, just so you understand kind of what we do. Our water program that I direct has a signature initiative called Aqueduct, which is a global water risk mapping tool, which is now being used by thousands of companies, international organizations, governments, and academics worldwide. It provides information, very granular information on water-related risks. It's totally open source, anyone can use it. So one thing I guess I want to say in context here, and John, we can go to the slides, is that the corona pandemic has really laid bare at a global scale some stark realities. The fates of the poorest and the richest people and economies are intertwined. There are enormous inequities that are faced by many of the world's 7.5 billion people, a little bit more than that right now. And we're seeing that many disasters experienced around the world, whether those are natural disasters, are in fact driven by water. Can we go to the next slide? As Anthony mentioned, we produced a report which launched in January, using some of our Aqueduct very granular data, aggregated up to a country level and global level, to look at what would it cost to actually meet the goals that we have for sustainable water management globally, which include giving many people much more reliable access to clean water. And what we see here in these figures are that almost half of the world's population right now, let me say that again, almost half of the world's population live in areas that are potentially or are experiencing water stress at least 1 month per year. And of course, in many parts of the world, this is a much more common occurrence. We've projected a 56% deficit by 2030 in water supply relative to demand. Now, past reports done by McKinsey have projected a lower number. It's not that so much that that number has risen, is that we've done a different analysis. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the point here is that this is a really significant challenge already, putting climate change aside and so on. And I think another really important thing for us to think about here is that 3 billion people, again, almost half, 40% of the world's population, lack access to basic hand washing facilities. So in this moment in time, during the global pandemic, imagine if you don't have enough water to wash your hands adequately to be able to spread, to prevent the spread of the virus. So that's part of the inequity, that's part of the rich-poor divide. Next slide, please. But what we also see, as Antony's mentioned, is that we're sort of effectively reducing the value of the water, the freshwater resources that we do have. 80% of sewage is dumped into our water bodies untreated. That may seem alarming for those of us that are obviously, many of us coming from the developed world, but that's a reality in more and more places. And even in places in the developed world where there has been decent sewage treatment, that and other water management to reduce pollution, that's actually been declining. So we've looked at the deaths that we've seen from the COVID crisis, the pandemic. Over 2 million people every year die of water-related diarrheal diseases. 90% of these are children. So this is already an ongoing crisis underneath the crisis that we're currently experiencing. So in addition to too little, too polluted, next slide please, we also, as Antony has mentioned, in many places see too much water. We're seeing increasingly, we recently in April released our new aqueduct floods tool, which does analysis of current flood levels and impacts on populations, on GDP, on urban assets, and projects it forward with climate change scenarios, is that the number of people that are going to be affected by floods is going to double in the next 10 years. We're going to see threefold increases in urban property damage. And that looks at both riverine and coastal storm surge flooding. We're seeing very significant increases. And as Antony has noted, in many places that are affected by drought or scarcity, they're also affected by flooding. So they're getting clobbered really from both sides by both issues. What we said in the next slide, please, in our Achieving Abundance report that looked at all of the different goals of the SDG 6 report is that we can meet these goals for a little bit more than 1% of global GDP. Now, obviously, that meant something in January that's different now. We're seeing declines in GDP at a country level. We're seeing massive outlays in economic recovery and stimulus funding. Let's talk about that later. That could be going to the right things. But let's just for a moment put that in context. 29 cents per person per day for a 15-year period would actually allow us to get to the point where everybody has adequate access to water and sanitation, where we're adequately managing the water resources that we have. So how should we respond? I just want to make a couple of points here and then turn it back to Antony. Obviously, we'll have more discussion about this too. I think there are 3 key points. The first is that we have to really, it's no longer forgivable to have 40% of the population without access to water to wash their hands, much less for drinking or for safety purposes, and that 2 million people can die every year from diarrheal diseases. We need to supercharge investment in clean water access and sanitation. We should do so in a way that is much more community level driven. So I'd love to see us invest in countries in community level public works programs that really build jobs and small and medium enterprises. The second thing we need to do is start effectively managing the water resources that we do have. We treat them as if they're inexhaustible, which they are not. We're in the midst of really a crisis, maybe that 56% deficit number. We need better data and transparency of that data and real-time monitoring of where the water is. We need better governance. We need to set actual sustainable limits for how much water we're withdrawing relative to how much water we have. It is possible to do all of these things. And we need to invest in and use water more efficiently. And we need to climate into account as we look at all these things. The third thing we need to do is we need to build back better. So as I mentioned, $10 trillion in economic stimulus has already occurred since the beginning of the pandemic. There's obviously a lot of discussion about the need for, increased stimulus and recovery. At some point, those numbers will be tapped out if you consider that that's already about 10 trillion is already about 10% of global GDP. So the opportunity is now when we make investments, to make investments in water, but to ensure that we're doing so in a way that we're building more resilient and efficient and closed loop ecosystems for water, that we're integrating green infrastructure, natural infrastructure, that is watersheds, wetlands, source water protection, along with gray infrastructure. We can talk more about that. And investing in the right kinds of solutions with respect to energy and agriculture that will actually put less strain on water systems. All three of those are really important components of building back better as well. So there's much work to be done. And I will, I guess, leave it there, Anthony. I'm sure we'll talk more about these ideas.
Great, thank you, Betsy. Now I'm going to hand over to you, Ambika. The financing side, obviously a good way to bring you in, not just because you have been in banking, but also given what the Dutch government is trying to do. And I think the 10 billion number is an interesting one, whether done as, in terms of how much stimulus we've had, and also the 1% of GDP is an interesting one. I'll just point out as we pop into this one, of course, that one of the biggest issues is getting that financing coming through, which is how we look at it a lot, is where it comes from. And as someone said to me, if you look on the climate change side, where I think you've got all these various institutional investors who have signed up for the Climate Action 100 Plus to try and get companies to reduce their emissions, have between them about $42 trillion of assets under management. So if they really were pushing to finance stuff and to get things to change, we'd have no problem whatsoever. Everything would be fine. Will be fine. Obviously, it's not as simple as that. So, Ambika, since you've been on both the banking side and now on the government side, how does all this fit together for you? What are you seeing that's not working, and how are you trying to change it?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I also think, just to reiterate what Betsy was just saying, the whole concept of governance, the whole problem of political willingness is an issue. You see investors, it's not that there's a lack of money. I'm glad that everybody sort of went with the 0% on the poll for lack of financing. Indeed, there is enough money in the world. It's just that there is nothing to motivate it to really move towards financing good water solutions. So you see water people often struggling to find public financing, concessional financing, donor funding, which is a tiny, tiny portion of the money that we have available in the world. You don't really see private financiers, you don't see investors entering this market, entering the scope and trying to actually be incentivized to do more. And now why does that happen? We've been speaking with investors very much. I've been on the banking side, of course, and now also in the government, to understand what makes them move. So what made them take action? How did Climate Action 100 come about? And what we did was we tied hands with Ceres, which is an NGO in the US, who's been working with these investors on Climate Action 100. And we said, how do we do this for water? And the investors said, there's two things that make us move. One is if we understand the materiality of these challenges to our own investments. So Betsy was talking about how, the world is suffering from the water, how many people don't have access to water, what that might lead to. But that still seems like a far away sort of story for investors. What they need to understand is, what does this mean financially? Are there investments at risk? And I think it's a little bit counterintuitive, actually, when you think about it, that investors, bankers, when they lend money to even breweries who are fully dependent on water, there are no considerations on water risks actually made in their investment decisions. And this is where we find it very shocking. So this is what we're trying to do now is, you see a slide up right now. This is the Valuing Water Finance Task Force that we've launched. Right now it has 1.7 trillion in assets under management, represented by about 13 investors all over the world. This is growing, so this is not the end. This is just the start. We launched this only a couple of weeks ago. And the idea is to, first of all, understand how material is water to their portfolio, where are they investing? What risks do they actually run financially if they don't address water risks? And the other is to set out clear expectations for corporates. So corporates understand water, they value water. We had a conversation with mining companies in South Africa and asked them, hey, why don't you value water? And they said, you must be crazy if you think we don't value water. Of course we value water. We cannot work if we don't have water. But the way they do it is to ensure that they have access to water, which often means communities don't, which often means that water resources are being polluted. In the absence of regulation, there is no incentive to do it. In the absence of investors not making it and preference in investment decisions, corporates are not incentivized to do this in a way that provides water security for everybody. So they are now working on this, and corporates need this sort of pressure that would come from CFOs, that would come from analysts asking smarter questions on water. So what we're hoping for is that we will have materiality assessments, and that we will have clear expectations that investors will put forward to the corporates, the thousands of corporates that they invest in, so that they can behave in a more water secure way. Just one maybe last point. You can see 13 investors controlling 1.7 trillion here. So even if you move a handful of them, even if you move a small portion of investors, you actually see a huge systemic change in how water is valued. And those are the kind of intelligent things we're trying to do now, is to stop trying to solve this in a project by project way, but really try to treat this water blindness, as we call it, systemically rather than in an isolated project manner. Looking forward to discussing this more, but just wanted to give a little bit of a feeling on how we're trying to approach this with financiers.
Great, thank you, Ambika. And now over to you, Giulio. Obviously, the Nature Conservancy has been involved in a fair number of different types of projects involving water. You were going to give a few examples of what you've seen and how, what you guys have done and what you've seen to show us, firstly, how we can improve our approach, but also, I think, as you said to us beforehand, this may also raise some questions about what we do next. So over to you.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. Let me maybe build on the comments that Betsy and Ambika have made. And first I'll complexify a little bit further, because water is endlessly fascinating, because it just can get endlessly complicated. And then offer a few examples of solutions. So, Betsy made the point that you can analyze the problem and come to the conclusion that on a daily payments basis, solving the water problem is actually relatively cheap. That's not this kind of the issue, right? But one of the things that all of us that work in water have, I think, come to realize over the years is that sometimes the sort of marginal view of a daily payment, how much would it cost on a daily basis to actually make something happen, is sort of deceptive, because the problem is what Ambika was raising, which is how do you actually get capital in? And a lot of these, a lot of the water solutions are kind of capital intensive. So if you think about kind of a spectrum, at one end of the spectrum, the easiest thing to do is to build a desalination plant for a mining company, actually. It's you have a secure payer who's going to pay you for the water, and you're going to therefore have a secure cash flow, and on that basis you can get a loan or some equity investment from somebody and build your desalination plant. That solution is very, very expensive. The marginal cost of that water is way higher than what Betsy was talking about, and it doesn't really solve any of the issues that she was describing, but it's easy to do, and in fact it's been done many, many times before. So if you have a lot of money and you have somebody willing to pay, and you have a balance sheet to put the money on, then kind of the problem solves itself. The problem is that often that's not the situation in water. You have at the other end of the spectrum, these massive problems of coordination where most of the problems reside. And so the example I can give you is we work a lot in the United States on the Mississippi Basin. And this is the richest country on the planet, right? It's in the United States. Mississippi is a very, very large river. It's 40% of the contiguous United States. It's the largest breadbasket on the planet. It's the largest canal system on the planet. It's the largest system of ports on the planet. And if you sit in New Orleans, the coastline is losing a football field of land mass every 45 minutes because people in Minnesota have built dams that stop the sediment from flowing all the way down. And then the people in the middle of the river basin have to treat water to very, very high specification because of all the nutrients and pesticides that get put in the higher reaches of the Mississippi. And the problem is that nobody actually owns the full problem, right? And so even though you can imagine how you'd solve it, it's sort of difficult to imagine how you'd coordinate 40% of the United States to get this done. So even in a place where you have limited, richer than Croesus, you still can't get this done because you don't have the institutions. I should point out that the United States had solved a version of this problem ages ago with an institution called the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a famous utility. Now, I mean, now it's a utility, but it used to be one of FDR's. It's fashionable now to quote Roosevelt in these days. So FDR set up the Tennessee Valley Authority as a way of solving exactly this problem. You need an institution with massive executive power that then go in an entire river basin and solve the coordination problem. It turns out they only did it once because the amount of executive power this institution had to have felt quite undemocratic to people living in the Tennessee Valley. So that's all to say that whilst, you know, the points that Betsy and Ambika have made are very good and right, it is cheap and there is plenty of money out there. The problem is finding institutions and balance sheets that can intermediate payments by somebody who has money to pay every day and every year with, you know, holding capital for many years, decades, and sometimes even longer. Now, there's an additional problem that we didn't have when the Tennessee Valley Authority was around, which is we now expect our watersheds to deliver a whole bunch of other things on top of water security. So now we're not only looking to watersheds like the Mississippi River, for example, to kind of solve the problems of water security of folks living in New Orleans or people living in the Ohio River or whatever. We're also expecting these massive land masses to absorb a whole bunch of carbon because remember, we need our landscapes and our farmers to absorb lots of carbon out of the atmosphere. We're going to meet the Paris Agreement. We're also going to expect these watersheds to deliver lots of protection for biodiversity because we're all going to sign up to biodiversity convention targets, and that will mean that a lot of these watersheds will also have to have lots of wilderness and a lot of biodiversity in them. And so we're making the problem of coordination and the problem of achieving a kind of good outcome ever more complicated, right? So is there any hope? And as it turns out, I think there is, in fact, and two last examples I'll give you to kind of feed a bit the conversation is one is an example from Cape Town, which was mentioned before as one of the opening points that I think, Antony, you made about Cape Town being, you know, having reached day zero almost 2 years ago. So in Cape Town, we've sort of decided we will work ourselves at the heart of this coordination problem with the city of Cape Town. And we sort of analyzed the problem. It turns out that one of the reasons Cape Town solutions are as cheap as Betsy suggests is that 2 months of water a year in Cape Town are used by eucalyptus trees, which are an invasive species. So, you know, ages ago, the Brits primarily thought it a good idea to grow lots of eucalyptus in the watershed of the Cape because it looked pretty. But it turns out these are very thirsty trees. And if you restore the ecosystem to its original arid vegetation, you can release 2 months of water a year. And the city, which had to almost commit to building desalination plants to meet its water security objectives, decided it might be a good idea to try and help restore the watershed instead. Now, note, the city doesn't own the watershed, so there are some coordination issues there. But nevertheless, we've started doing this work, and indeed we've already released about 4.8 billion liters of water into the city of Cape Town as a result of this, and the cost is a fraction of what a desalination plant would cost. So we've done this in a number of places around the world, and I can talk more if you want, but you can intermediate capital to go in investments in these types of kind of coordination and kind of restoration of activities that do release cheap water. And it is possible to scale them up. And then I'll just give you the last example, which is kind of a wish at the moment, but it's an Uber Cape Town story. We figured, well, if you can get the city of Cape Town to pay for the restoration of the Cape, could you get Botswana to pay for the protection of Angola's headwaters in the Okavango Basin? All right, and it's a massive river crossing 3 countries. Same kind of problem, actually. Angola is about to develop a lot of agriculture and a lot of hydropower in its upper reaches in order to sustain its economic development. Downstream, Botswana depends on the water that comes from Angola. If Angola develops all this water without any notion of the impacts on Botswana, just like Minnesota and New Orleans, you'll get a disaster because you'll get the delta, particularly the Okavango Delta, drying up completely. Could you set up a system that coordinates between the two, that gets the kind of downstream benefits to pay somehow for the upstream interventions, which ought to be the cheapest possible options, not the desal plants, but the cheapest possible options in the world that Betsy was describing. And early stage kind of process suggests that this is indeed possible. There is a lot of appetite from the 3 countries, riparian countries, to engage in this, and it may indeed be possible that we'll have a Uber sort of Cape Town type water fund soon on the Okavango. So I'll stop there. I'll just summarize by saying, I think, you know, the set of these conversations in water are always like that. It's cheap to solve, and why aren't we solving it? And the fact is that the devil's in the details, and a lot of it has to do with the lack of institutions that can take on the capital and then sort of pay for the infrastructure. The problem is even more complicated now because we expect all these watersheds to deliver many, many more values than we used to: carbon sequestration, nature, all these things. But it turns out that if you're kind of clever, you can take that complexity and turn it to your advantage. And examples like the one of Cape Town or the Okavango or the many others that we've done around the world suggest that you can kind of stack these values and mobilize people to pay for upstream protection, restoration, watersheds whilst delivering water security downstream. So, Antony, I'll stop there and then see if we can get into a conversation.
Great. Thanks, Giulio. I must admit, so I'm just going to turn down my AC unit while we do this. So, I must admit, listening to you there, I almost thought you were the banker on the panel talking about, you know, doing clever things to try and persuade people to part with their money. I mean, Ambika, maybe you could find Giulio a job in banking if he needs it at some point in the future. But what you're talking about though, Giulio, it sounds great, but is the money coming from the usual suspects that Ambika sort of hinted at earlier on, or are you finding that there is a broader source of capital out there looking to get into this kind of thing?
I think there is starting to be a broader source of capital. So the encouraging signs are that a lot of the kind of downstream peri-urban companies that depend on the water security of these places are willing to put some money to play. I think at the moment it's a mix of goodwill and water security. In other words, people are investing in the story of water security, and then they're willing to put a bit of money to play. Nothing close to what is actually needed. My suspicion, for what it's worth, is that when we start actually relying systematically on carbon sequestration in these watersheds, a lot more money will show up, and that's ahead of us. But it's not 50 years ahead of us. I think it's in the next 10 years. I think we'll see a lot more money sort of going in. But Betsy may have some ideas on this.
Yeah, Betsy, over to you. Then Ambika, over to you after that.
Yeah, I was just going to mention some project work that we're doing right now in the US West, which is a glimmer of hope, I think, for that in terms of bringing in kind of more traditional investors, insurance companies, others. We've helped local water agencies in the Sierra and the Northern California area to release new green bonds, which are actually going in and thinning forest areas so that they're less susceptible to catastrophic wildfire. Huge issue, of course, in California and other places in the world, because the downstream water impacts are so enormous from that. So it's been very interesting to see who's been willing to invest in those green bonds. And we have a project right now with the City of San Francisco, their Public Utility Commission, to do sort of advanced capital planning, to think about what are all the different capital flows that they already have from the bonds that they issue and so on, that could be directed toward more investment in natural infrastructure upstream because it reduces downstream flooding. It doesn't wipe out bridges and all the kinds of things I just talked about. It reduces water pollution issues, increases supply. So I think and when these green bonds are being issued with respect to water-related projects, they are selling out very, very quickly. There is a market for these. So, you know, not to sort of overstate, it's still very early days, but I think there's enormous opportunity here. We just need to figure out how to capitalize on that better and how to do a better job, to Giulio's point. And Ambika will have a point of view on this too, of in the intermediary, how to be the sort of the missing middle right now. There's an enormous amount of interest in financing these kinds of projects. There's an enormous amount of interest on the private capital and public capital side in financing those kinds of projects, but there's a lack of deals in the middle. There's a sort of lack of planning and preparatory facilities for early stage development around these capital projects and a way of aggregating enough of them together that you can actually attract, you know, larger flows of capital. So that's a very interesting space that actually I think all three of our organizations are working
on. Ambika.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly, you know, these green bonds and green loans have taken off a lot. We see trillions and trillions that are being held by investors where they have either committed to investing in green things, so they're looking quite actively to find green opportunities to invest in, or they're just, you know, looking to also build legacy. So that's also interesting and a nice development in the market where you see that there are thirsty investors if you can call them that, no pun intended. But I think what Giulio was hinting a little bit earlier about how desalination, large infrastructure, still is easy to do is because that's what's in the comfort zone of what we understand. As bankers, we have enough legacy business. We have enough to show that there will be an off-taker. It makes it very simple, while as the nature-based solutions, even simple things that you were just talking about as examples, Giulio or Betsy, I mean, those just seem so foreign, so far away, and so innovative. And innovative is nice for many people to hear, but not for a banker to hear. So it's very, I think it's a very interesting development that is taking place. But what I see missing very often, and this is where, when I look at the government funding that we do now, is that we are funding things with the objective of funding the project for the time that we are putting our money in it. So if the government is providing 10 million for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, they're asking for project planning for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, rather than thinking about how do you leverage this public funding for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to attract private funding for the next 20, 30, 40 years, so that you don't have to, so it can move away from public balance sheets into private balance sheets. But that requires a very high level of financial understanding, financial planning, speaking the language of financiers, which is also very different and difficult, and anticipating a lot more in terms of commercial returns that people are not doing at this moment. The largest motivation remains water security rather than I'm going to make sure that this turns into a financial cash flow. And I've seen the role of financial advisors come in, and I think if we can include more and more these ex-bankers, ex-financial advisors who speak this language and bridge the gap between the people who want to invest and the people who have projects that eventually, if not today, will become commercially viable, then we can start moving this needle from public funding into private funding even quicker and sooner.
Giulio, you want to add something?
Yeah, I very much agree with both Betsy and Ambika's points. And I would just like to add, I mean, sometimes those of us who work in the sector sort of get excited by the frontier. So if you take a step back, let's remember, water doesn't attract a lot of money, even in its most kind of simple form, right? I mean, it's not, water investments are difficult, and they don't have, if you have an option between a water investment and an energy investment, the ROI on investment, energy investment will always be higher. And so it's kind of hard to attract capital to water projects unless you realize things like, well, water tends to be counter-cyclical, and so in a portfolio, it's actually a pretty good investment, et cetera, et cetera. But we've had a kind of a gap in financing on just traditional water infrastructure for years and years and years. I mean, this conversation on kind of financing gap could have been had 30 years ago, right? Now, what's different now is I think that a bit to what Ambika was saying, there's an opportunity to change the conversation about what the source of value is for those water investments. Because more and more water investments are in a more complicated system where you're also adding insurance value, as Betsy was talking about, or carbon value, or just public good value that some city is willing to pay because they want to preserve some park, right? So the skill is in stacking up all these sources of values until the ROI becomes higher than it's traditionally been. If it's just about water security, it's really, really hard to get to the kinds of returns that would attract by itself private capital. And there's a long conversation about why private-public partnerships haven't worked so well either. But just on the private capital basis, I think that's the challenge. How do we change it from a water investment to a basic public development and economic development infrastructure investment that serves water security and lots of other things?
I'm just looking at some of the questions that have come through, and one of them, I mean, did come through relatively early on, but I think we already were addressing that, so maybe we didn't quite get to convince them. But so when you read a lot of the reports around transitioning to a low carbon economy, the areas people focus on are energy, infrastructure, transport, and cities and so on, but not water. So how do you change that? And just from my perspective, it's funny actually. At one of the big water conferences last year, all water people were saying we need to find that carbon 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees scenario moment. Idea, whatever it is. And I said to them, well, that's fair enough, but the carbon guys are actually looking at those who are going after the plastics, saying if only we had, as carbon guys, carbon emissions people, the ability to have the same kind of headlines that those going after the plastics are getting. So everyone wants something they've not got, I suppose. The grass always looks greener. Pardon the sort of vaguely water-driven pun there. But to try and address this person's question a bit more, are there ways that we can bring water further up the agenda? I mean, Giulio, in part you addressed it. It's making it more more about than just water security. But is there anything else? Ambika, I'll throw that one to you.
Yeah, I'm relatively an outsider to the water sector, so I have been here for a year now, really fully involved in water. I think one of the issues with the narrative often tends to be that there are different organizations all focusing on different aspects of water. Betsy, in her introduction, already showed us the three big issues: too much, too little, too polluted. That's already complex. So it's not just too much emissions. We need to solve that, bring down emissions. That's simpler, let's say. With water, there are already three aspects. We have different types of parties who are voting and whose agenda is maybe wash, is maybe biodiversity, is maybe what Giulio was talking about, in terms of how do you actually do carbon sequestration. So there's so many things that water has that I believe we're too fragmented, and there's not a clear ask. And it may not be the 1.5 degree ask. It may not be the stop single-use plastic ask. But I feel that the narrative lacks one voice that comes from the water sector towards outsiders who are dealing with so many issues, who have to deal with so many of the other problems that we are talking about, that they cannot grasp the complexity. We need to make it simpler. And that I think lacks to a large extent because of the fragmentation and the segmentation and the voices of the water sector.
Betsy.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point, and I agree with everything that's been said here. And I mean, I think part of the problem is that for a whole host of historic reasons, we've allowed the marginal cost curve for water to regard it as flat. And what happens is, because it's flat, and of course it's not actually, and when you run out of water, the cost curve goes essentially vertical, that we need to start building in a way of acknowledging that that cost curve is actually increasing. And it's challenging to do. Water is a human right. It's very difficult to get people to get their mind around that. Actually, a lot of companies are starting to do internally risk-adjusted valuation and pricing so that they can get the ROIs to make sense for the kinds of investments they know they need to make. And frankly, countries and governments need to do the same thing. But what I think is an opportunity is at the city level. A lot of city leaders are understanding that they are in essentially competition with one another. WRI does work in over a couple hundred cities through our Sustainable Cities Network. And what's very interesting to me is that work started with transport issues, and then it moved on to focusing on energy and climate issues. The one issue that we're finding city leaders are asking us more and more about is water. They see it as the thing that they are most exposed to: too much, too little, too polluted, all of it. They don't know how to tackle it. They want to figure out how to tackle it. And they realize that they are in competition. If they can't provide enough water for companies, for increasing sort of economic development, that will go elsewhere. And so I think that's an opportunity to build on that awareness. I mean, take India as an example. This is an existential crisis for India, this being, how are they going to manage the water resources that they have and do that more effectively? And the government knows it, but it's a very, very challenging problem to solve, both through top-down edict, but also a lot of really smart things that need to bubble up from the bottom. And I think some of it is that we need to be funding very different kinds of things than we have been in the past. In the same way that we wouldn't or we shouldn't be building 19th century coal-fired power plants or 20th century plants. We should not be building the same sort of hub and spoke, very intensely expensive and carbon intensive water distribution systems. We should be building much more decentralized, sort of closed loop systems. Many cities in the developing world are in fact going to that. So in places in Africa where 80% of the infrastructure or more that needs to be in place hasn't even been built yet, let's leapfrog what we have been doing and start to invest in those smarter approaches. And there is actually a marketplace for that. And there are businesses that are anxious, eager to really start to invest and draw in investment to make those kinds of changes.
Is it a matter of size of investment as well? I think, Giulio, you kind of alluded to that. I've seen that to some extent in energy as well, that you can, of course, get very big energy projects to create battery storage, whatever, that takes a lot of money. But is it that so many of the investments we're looking at here, especially in the developing world, don't require the huge amounts of money that the big institutional investors are willing to put out? Is that one of the issues that's keeping funding back as well?
Sort of. I mean, I think you know, if you think about a country like, say, Ethiopia, for example, right? It has, today, I suppose it's a bit better. It has maybe 50, 60 cubic meters of storage per capita available, compared to, say, the US has 4,000 cubic meters of storage per capita. Even if you accept the point that Betsy made, which I think is right, which is we probably don't want to replete the 20th century kind of cement, kind of extravaganza that we had. We still need to deliver storage. We're losing storage around the world very faster than we're building it. So our capacity to intermediate just the climate system is going down, right? So all of us experience water very oddly. We're in a planet covered with water. It runs all over the place, yet none of us have to wade a river to go to work. None of us have to wonder how we're going to get water other than turning a tap on a wall, which is kind of extraordinary. All of that costs a lot of money. So for many countries, particularly developing and poorest countries, the gap between what they have and what they need is enormous, and it does actually require enormous amounts of capital investment. The problem is, whose credit-worthy balance sheet is that going to go on? Because most of that stuff is a public good. The country will develop thanks to some degree of water security. If you don't have to wade a river going to work, you're probably going to be 20, 30% more productive. But monetizing that is very, very hard. And so I don't know that there's a story about, you know, projects not big enough. I think that's true. But the big theme here is it's a bet on the development of the future. I mean, frankly, in some ways, you know, regrettably for those of us who worry about the landscape, the state of the landscape, the most successful water security development story is China's, right? I mean, they lifted a whole bunch of people out of insecurity. They did so by pouring enormous amounts of cement all over the place, but, you know, how can you tell them they're wrong? I mean, everybody now doesn't wade a river going to work, you know? So if you don't have a powerful state that can deploy capital, borrow on the capital markets, or print money, then you're in trouble because the private sector not really be the alternative there.
Ambika.
Yeah, I think that's exactly you know, I completely agree with you, Giulio. And I think one of the issues that I see, at least now sitting in the government space where we are working with countries like Ethiopia and others, is political willingness. And the problem that happens is ministries are siloed. So if the water ministry puts money into actually solving a lot of the water problems or challenges, the benefits are experienced by the health ministry, by the transport ministry, by the industry ministry. It's not experienced directly by the water ministry. So it's your costs, but the benefits go to someone else's balance sheet. And often it's simple stuff like this that you don't want in your ideal world. That's not, you should be looking at things in a landscape way and in a system way, and you should really care about the country as a whole. But in real life, that's not what happens. People have their own budgets and they have their own ministries and they're trying to do things that work best for themselves. And they're conflicted because water has its benefits outside of water. And that's very difficult to account for and very difficult to show. But happy to hear Betsy, what she thinks about that as well.
Well, just maybe one other point on this. I don't disagree with this. You know, I very much agree about the siloing and the challenges of matching up where the benefits are derived and who's going to pay for those. And we don't have good institutional mechanisms for that, for sure. But I think we have to get more creative about this, or we're not going to solve these problems. We do have an aggregation problem. It is tough when investors would be delighted to invest in a $100 million desal plant. They get it, it's big, it's fat, it's a place to park a lot of money, versus 15,000 smaller storage approaches, which in fact would be very, very useful in a place like Ethiopia, which is naturally quite variable in terms of rainfall. And that's getting worse because of climate change. There, to Giulio's point, they're absolutely going to have more storage. But what kind of storage? Grand Renaissance Dam is valuable. I mean, what you think about that politically in terms of its energy value and what else it can do for the country. But small scale storage that villages and farmers can tap into for supplemental irrigation and water supply are also very, very doable. So, and necessary. The problem is there's no aggregation mechanism. So if I'm an investor, I can't go out and see where those 15,000 projects are. But if an intermediary can bring those together, and create a sort of tranche of fundable projects that we have, a fairly strong degree of belief will actually, succeed and have creditworthiness and so on. I mean, that's the place where I think we need to get much, much smarter about how we tackle water challenges. And not just in the developing world. We need to do the same kind of thing the city of Philadelphia, I will say, has been doing natural infrastructure to deal with its stormwater problem. And it made a bet on working on both private property lands and public property lands, that it could bring in a lot of capital if it acted as the aggregator, essentially, of that. And the jury's out as to whether that will be entirely successful, but there are some examples of cities and other institutions stepping up and doing that I've just described.
And we've got a couple of questions that sort of deal with technology, which we haven't quite got into. I mean, nature-based solutions sometimes uses it, and sometimes is quite effective at just working out how to use the environment as it stands. I think Giulio, some of what Nature Conservancy has been doing over the years, helping city watersheds further upstream has been useful in this. But a couple of questions we've got are basically talking about, what solutions are out there for improving water efficiency, for example. I'm not sure efficiency is the only thing we worry about here, but the idea of using natural capital for cities, for example, I saw some of these down in New Orleans as well, in addition to Philadelphia and elsewhere, is really very useful. Whether it's porous sidewalks and the like, or whether you're using natural habitat as a way to sort of store floodwaters so that it doesn't inundate the city of New Orleans, say, as quick as it might have done. So, I mean, one of them is on efficiency, but someone else is also talking about, what innovations have you seen that help on to develop water security? I mean, have you seen anything in particular that stands out? I mean, all I've seen recently is people, certainly utilities, using big data, maybe AI, and maybe just remote sensors to improve things, or thinking they should now use them after the pandemic in part because they can't get people out to work at various places anymore. And the byproduct of that is you actually have a more efficient system that maybe wastes water less. But sort of two-handed idea there. But Giulio, let me throw it to you. What have you seen, or what have you guys worked on, or what have you seen recently that you think stands out?
Yeah, we've done some of these investments. Betsy described the work with cities on sort of green infrastructure within cities, right? And that's quite generalizable. I think if I were to bet, I think that the big sort of disruption here is in water, not just in water, but certainly in water, is the degree of precision with which we'll be able to optimize land use across large landscapes. And that's enabled by two basic things. And, if I had to, somebody asked about what you'd have to do if you were to philanthropically support things that make a difference at scale, because you can always put money into, the next piece of kit. But remember, the water sector is $500 billion a year, and that just essentially is water spent, is money spent in America and Europe. So if you imagine having to spend your way into helping billions and millions of people, there's a lot of people before you get to the state. So you need the states to actually play a real role here. But there are two big gaps that I see. One is it's kind of wonky, but really important, and it gets to the point that Ambika said, is there are so many public institutions that do not have the skills and personnel to essentially seriously project finance and underwrite projects. Remember, most public sector institutions don't have a balance sheet. They are essentially cash flow finance. It's essentially budget financing everything. So much money comes into the tax receipt, so much money you can spend this year. That's it. You're not actually doing an NPV on the future of the economic value of the thing. And in most cases, that's because personnel's not there to do it. It simply isn't an accounting for the shadow balance sheet of the public sector. And so if you have money to spend, provide that to key public institutions. The second thing is, I think this point you were making, Antony, about AI-enabled optimization, where we live in a remarkably different world than even 10 years ago. You can take a picture every day, a 30-centimeter resolution anywhere on the planet. You can essentially tell what a farmer is doing on their plot and infer what effect that has on water. That data is the basis for market creation. For example, we've set up a fund in Australia. Australia is a bit ahead of the rest of the world in a number of ways, behind in others, but in some ways they're ahead, in terms they have a very fungible water market. And we are able to arbitrage between the needs of water for people and needs of water for nature based on very precise information about who needs what, where, and when, right? And so we are able to provide a return to investors whilst essentially selling water to rich people that need it when it's really, really scarce, and then using that return to then gift water to nature, which typically needs it when there's plenty of it anyway, for when there's enough of it, right? you can imagine that that's a small, it's a, you know, $20–30 million investment, but you can imagine scaling that kind of initiative up. There's enormous potential for arbitrage if you have a lot of information about what the landscape is doing and what function it's playing at any given point in time. And I think that's going to get us out of, you know, the sort of large multi-purpose infrastructure, because you can get the landscape to play that role instead.
Betsy?
Yeah, I think those are all really good points that Giulio has made. And I like the point about the big disruption could be optimizing land use, because the land use water connection is not well understood or appreciated, and it's everything, really. I think the opportunity also is where we can get to in relatively short order using remote sensed satellite-based data for understanding in near real-time terms what's the current water quality in a given water body, at least with respect to nutrients, because you can actually see in the spectral footprint, you can see how much algae there is, and that relates to how much nutrient pollution there is. And then also where the water is. So we've done some initial work to actually do a global reservoir monitoring sort of analysis or system that would provide that kind of data. And in places around, many places around the world, those reservoirs, like is in Cape Town, are used both for agriculture, for industry, and to serve cities. And so it could be a sort of early warning system. And part of the problem here is that we're flying blind. We have very, very bad monitoring systems. And a lot of the actual in-stream gauging systems that we've had, even in the US, we've lost almost a third of those gauges over time. They've not been reinvested in. And the situation is far worse elsewhere in the world. So as important as water is, we have no idea. You know, we're sort of using these mass balance models, but we don't really know what's going on. And I'll use an example of something that WRI has been involved in on forests, Global Forest Watch, which is based on analysis that's done by the University of Maryland, which allows us every 16 days to get at a 10-meter resolution or smaller, a sense of, is the forest still there or have trees been cut? And it actually allowed companies that wanted to go to zero deforestation palm oil in their supply chains to make those commitments in part, because we now have a monitoring system for that. We desperately need such a monitoring system for water. There is no transparency. There is no accountability mechanism, truly, for governments. And at the end of the day, that's another place that we need to get to. We have some of the models that are needed. We have the satellite data. We haven't had the investment to do that on either the water quality or supply side, but we could make that investment.
How would that fit with the issues of governance that you've all brought up as well? And I'm just thinking of, you know, of one particular technological innovation. It actually wasn't that particularly tech heavy, but it was a new kind of irrigation system. And the guy was showing it to me. He said, I presented it to someone in Arizona who was growing alfalfa, which, you know, is probably not the best use of water in a very arid state, which doesn't have first claim on the water. And I said, okay, well, that's great. So what happened? He said, well, he got such a better yield with it that he used the field next door to grow more alfalfa. It's like, well, that almost gets to the efficiency point I was talking about earlier on. Efficiency is one thing, but also if you don't have the governance in place to persuade people to, I suppose, do the right thing, for want of a better word, then no amount of new efficiency tools or even other technology gains is necessarily going to do the job, is it, Betsy? Oh, you're on mute still, Betsy.
Thanks. I think it's a really good point. And, you know, in the same way that we have a 1.5 degrees C sort of, you know, target for carbon, if you have no cap, you can't have really, you know, the sort of trading that even Giulio was talking about in Australia. Part of what Australia did for the Murray-Darling Basin was they said, we're going to say that here's how much water is available, here's how much has to go to the environment to allow the system to still operate, here's how much is available in any given year, based on how much it's raining and so on, for other uses, for farmers, for industry, for cities. We don't have that in many places, really almost any place in the world. We're operating as if our aquifers and our surface water sources are inexhaustible. And if we exhaust them, we'll just go get that water from somewhere else. Well, the lie is being put to the possibility of doing that anymore, because you can't just draw it from somewhere else, because it's already overtapped in those places. And so I think we're going to have to get to the point where we start to require this. I think actually part of what's going to hold government's feet to the fire to do so is some kind of big data transparency mechanism that, you know, sort of radical transparency that says, I mean, you can already do this in India. You can see how groundwater is being overdrafted and the rate at which it's being overdrafted based on some satellite information. And so I think we need to have a mechanism for sharing that data and then getting governments to actually start to take the steps that they need to have more of a sustainable yield. It's not simple by any means, but we have the basic information that we would need to do that in a rough way, in a sort of no regrets or low regrets kind of way. We just don't do it.
Ambika?
Yeah, just maybe, I know that we're edging close to the end time, so I'll try to keep it short, but it's two things. One is, of course, technological innovation. I'll touch upon that in just a second, but I also wanted to bring up the point of how, so I'm from India originally, and I've seen a lot of the infrastructure and how it goes. And, we have this sort of motto of build, ignore, rebuild. And often you can keep trying to sort of, come up with new innovation, but the problem remains in operations and management and just capacity building. So that's something to address, I think, even before we start going in for very technologically driven innovation. We need to be very mindful where it's going and who's going to actually be handling this. Another space I wanted to talk about, which I have found incredibly fascinating, is wastewater, actually. And would be great to hear from Betsy and Giulio if you have time to address this. But what we've seen is some very interesting work because of technological developments that you can actually extract a lot of high value materials from wastewater. So wastewater is no longer a waste, it actually becomes a source of a cash flow. It gives you some materials that otherwise are quite high value. And for example, there was, and now I'm blanking on the name of the river, but anyway, in Chile, where the government contracted somebody to clean the river and didn't have to pay for it because they said, okay, whatever comes out of the river in terms of waste is ours. They were able to extract a lot of high value metals and minerals from that, which they sold and actually had a positive cash flow at the end of it. So wastewater and how much they can extract and the innovation that goes into these extractive techniques is actually bringing a lot of good bankable solutions, I think, to the table, which I find quite fascinating in line with the circular economy.
Just to build on that, there's more energy value in sewage than is required to treat it. So you can develop biogas essentially, even from small, in slum areas, from communal toilets. There are systems that are actually, you can valorize that and you can pay for them by virtue of doing that. Now, if we could also then find ways, and there are ways, of capturing the water and reusing it for other purposes, cleaning it enough so that it could be used to irrigate farmland and so on, that adds yet another value. But just even the energy value, not the nutrient value for fertilizers, not even the water, is enormous, but we don't capture that.
Okay, well, look, we are coming up on time. I'm going to ask the panelists in a minute if they can come up with some sort of suggestions for how we can all have our own impact on trying to reduce water, whether it's simple stuff in the home, don't run the tap when brushing your teeth, which will not save a lot, but it's something, all the way through to contact if you know someone in the government who can do something, write to them. I'm going to ask them that in a minute. First of all, though, Joe, if you're around, I'd like you to pop up that poll again, the same one from the beginning, to see if there is any change in after what we've said in what people think and in the audience think is what's driving the problems of water security. So we'll get up in a second. Giulio, I'm going to go to you first on what, if anything, do you suggest people individually can do about avoiding the global water crisis, or even a local water crisis, I suppose, is maybe sometimes.
Well, I mean, there's two things that are, above all, if you are an entrepreneur, what the points that Ambika and Betsy made are really important. There's a lot of space for innovation. Water is kind of boring in a way, and so it tends not to attract the most exciting entrepreneurs, which means that if you do get involved, you have an enormous opportunity for impact, because everybody else is getting silicon and doing stuff in energy, and actually this is where you can make a biggest difference. But the other thing I would say is, it's not just a product, right? At the end of the day, reclamation creates new land. Flood protection decides where you live and who can live where. This is also about power and politics. And we should never forget, this is not just an equivalent to energy. There's a lot of politics in water, and the capacity of the public sector is a key. In fact, it's essential to the solution of any of these problems.
Great. Ambika?
I would say also in terms of just removing water blindness, it just seems like a lot of people have talked about this, that water never comes up. It's in the World Economic Forum's top risks. Water has been around for, I think, 8 years, if not more. That's embarrassing. Whatever capacity you are in, whatever business you work in, you're a water person. You rely on water. So what I would really, really urge everyone to do is to understand that where the water blindness is and try to address that in whichever organization it is that they work in. So that's something I would ask for. And yay, awesome results on the poll.
There you go, governance. It's all about governance. Betsy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess three. First, as we look around the world, and certainly what's happening where I am in the US around racial justice issues and kind of growing awareness of inequities, I think we just have to bridge that gap. I think we have to say we must make the investments that are needed to give people adequate access to water and sanitation, if only to protect ourselves. But obviously it's the right thing to do too. I mean, the next pandemic is going to have the same problem. That's one. Two, invest in nature and engineering. There's so much that it's so cheap, it's so smart, it's so objective to do that. It's not either or, it's both and. And the last one, in your own household, eat less meat. There's an enormous amount of water that goes into every pound of chicken or beef or anything else. So just have a few less meals every week that are meat-based.
Great, thank you for that, guys. I'd throw in, be mindful of your clothing as well. That can often take up far more water use than you would ever have personally in your entire life. So don't go, what's it, fast fashion? Is that the thing that's now meant to be thrown out the window? So let's draw it to a close. I think just thinking about what we've been talking about, yes, avoiding a worsening global water crisis is hard, but the money is there somewhere. The knowledge is out there somewhere. And there are some good projects that have already been done that show that we can come up with good ways of trying to solve this. But as I said, it's not easy to do and does require a lot of commitment and getting through some fairly tricky governance and other issues. So I'd like to thank Giulio, Betsy, and Ambika for joining me, and I'll hand back over to Joe and the Conduit team.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Just a very quick thank you from me to all of you. It's great to have you all with us. Thank you everyone for joining and all your questions. We will be following up with a number of the different resources and projects that Giulio, Betsy, and Ambika and Antony have mentioned, along with their contact details as well, so you can reach out to follow up on any conversations you'd love to have. So in the meantime, thank you, Antony. Thank you everyone for your time this evening. And we look forward to seeing you all at another event soon. So good night, everyone. Take care.